Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the Becoming a Treasurer series, author Craig Jeffery is interviewed on a chapter in his book, The Strategic Treasurer, a Partnership for Corporate Growth. The chapter is called Losses and Fraud, What Can Keep Treasurers Awake at Night? Topics of discussion center around situations of great loss of assets and liquidity, examples of high-profile fraudulent events, and guidance on how treasurers can best protect their organizations. Listen in to the discussion to find out more. Welcome to the podcast, Craig.
Thanks, Meredith.
Craig, I want to talk to you about one of the chapters in your book, The Strategic Treasurer. The chapter is called Losses and Fraud, What Can Keep Treasurers Awake at Night? It's a catchy title and it rings true as we all have things that keep us up at night. What did you have in mind while writing this chapter?
I wrote this chapter and some of the concepts in here. I really intended this to make sure that treasurers and those on their way to becoming a treasurer gained the right type of perspective or had a right mindset for protecting against fraud and losses that can occur from external attacks, a weakness of controls, or exposures in a couple different areas. And it's been a while since I've written the book now, but there's certainly that has grown. If anybody is not concerned about fraud, whether or not you actually lose sleep or not, that might be another story. But this idea of how do we prepare so that we know things are at the best state we can have them in, considering amount of resources we have, that we're being careful with looking at what our exposure points are, the layers of defense, the human element, and the system. So this is really helping have the right mindset on providing protection for the organizations that the treasurers can do.
Excellent. What topics does it cover?
Yeah, so the chapter covers some examples of loss, right? There's some situations of significant loss of assets or reduction of liquidity. So it's a compendium of some case studies that we can all learn from. And there's many there, from trading losses to hedging experiences to loss and fictitious balances. It also covers examples of some fraud that has been perpetrated. These are examples not just meant to scare people, though that's kind of fun in a way of thinking about fraud. It's like, ooh, could this happen to us? But the real example here, the real reason for sharing information about fraud and these losses is to get us to think, what are we exposed to? Can we learn from particular fraud examples, whether you're covered for that or not? Is it instructive in terms of how you close specific gaps or how you apply specific security principles? And then finally, there's information and guidance about how to help prepare your organization to better protect against fraud, to prevent fraud, to identify these kind of issues or early warning signs before they occur, or to quickly shut them down if they start.
Why is the issues of losses and fraud so obvious and common for treasurers?
Well, there's a couple quotes I'd have. One of the reviewers of the book, Tim Hart, who at the time was Senior VP and Treasurer at First National Bank in Nebraska, said, "Treasury is the easiest place to make money and the easiest place to make your company fail." I think that's really crucial, because Treasury sits on the most liquid assets of the organization. They control the ins and outs of that to the outside world. So you can lose and run into bigger problems in Treasury than other areas because of what they're working with and dealing with. So that's why it's so important to treasurers. It's important to many others, from IT to the controllers group to AP. Treasury needs to have a particular focus on protecting and safeguarding the corporate's assets, particularly the most liquid assets.
Where should a treasurer focus on to best protect their organization?
On their most liquid assets. I think I think that's a good question because it can be, is this a list that people need to look at or is it a mindset? And I know you were going to ask me that question. So I was trying to think of how to answer it that's additive to the book and helpful for the current situation. So I think the best way to think about that has to do with surface areas of attack and roles. And what I mean by that is when we think about the surface areas of attack, if you're a system person, you think the desktop access points from the network. But I think more broadly about what are your exposure points is maybe another way to think about it. So a few of those areas might be through my banking structure. So this might be from a bank account level, my banking structure, my bank accounts, my permissions into the banking system. A second area would be people. A third would be the systems. And I am specifically mentioning that knowing that most of the people who listen to this podcast are treasury professionals. And some may say, isn't that IT's responsibility or data security or the security group? But there's a systems aspect of that too that the treasurer needs to be mindful of. And then on processes. So when we think about control of processes, there's a number of elements, as is the case with all those four areas. So if you want, I can describe a few points about each of those areas, or we can move on if you have other questions.
That would be great. No, that would be great if you could go through that.
On the bank account side and the banking structure is your banking structure needs to be designed in a way that's optimized for treasury purposes. And that means efficient movements, the cash mobilization needs to be designed properly. And it also needs to protect the most liquid assets of the organization. So your design of the banking structure matters, as does the security you put on those accounts. So whether they're account level controls or transaction level controls, that needs to fit into the overall structure and your overall plan for defense. But that also means keeping track of not only those security services that your banks offer and that you should use, but some of your other measures need to be supported there. Other measures meaning things like daily cash proof, which is a rapid reconciliation, as well as bank reconciliation, but also how you manage signers and permissioning and taking people off and making sure that those functions align with what's needed. The second area I think I mentioned was people or staff. What's the challenge or the surface area with people? Well, people can circumvent certain systems and controls in many ways, and they can be fooled. And this spoofing or fooling is rampant. It's far more sophisticated than it was when I wrote the book, and the success level has been massive. It's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars has been exfiltrated or pulled out of companies through this spoofing. The other element is there can be fraud on the part of people. Individuals can feel they're owed, and they could be a weakness. And I know that's not nearly as common in Treasury as we might like to think, but that is an area to be mindful of, in terms of staff and making sure that they're not that people aren't compromised. And I know there's lots on that. But the other area that I think is a much bigger issue is the credentials. Credentials compromise. If someone has too many rights, right? The principle of least privilege is really the principle of maximum privilege. Even if the person is completely honest and their motivations are purer than, freshly driven snow, if someone gets their credentials, then you've opened your organization up to too much loss, too much exposure, whether it's data or funds. So that's another element. And finally is people need to be updated in a similar way that software needs to be updated with new releases and security patches. What I mean by that is how are you making sure your staff is being updated on the latest security issues, fraud attacks, methods that criminals are using, how to defend yourself against that? And this involves everything from case studies, but it needs to be focused more than just desktop security or locking the door. It has to be, especially for Treasury, AP, payroll, different areas that generate payments or have access to that. They need to be, quite well trained on payment security, not simply IT security or just cybersecurity. I think that's a big missing element. We've seen really, really good progress on companies training more of their people, and those numbers are going up, but they're not training them on payment security as much as they are on desktop security and don't click on this email. Really helpful, but incomplete in some ways. So those are two. There's also systems and processes. On the system side, I think there's an aspect of who's in charge of systems. Well, there might be a process owner. There might be someone in IT who's in charge of keeping something functioning, running, whether it's running in-house or it's running through the cloud. But the point here on the systems, does the system support the overall security of processes? And that's vital. And is it, it's particularly around payment security, protecting, payment information, the payment process, the files and data that are used for making payments, whether you're encrypting the data, you're replacing the data with tokens, digital tokens, or whether you're moving that data outside the firm to your bank or a third-party tech firm so that nobody can steal that information. That's part of it. But I think the bigger issue here is who is responsible for security of the payment processes. So, and we think about the system side of that. There's a systems element and a data security element that is probably the responsibility of the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, hopefully looking at that. But there's an aspect of both systems and processes when it centers on payment processes that the treasurer is the superintendent of security in that regard, not in charge of all data security, not in charge of all other elements. And I know saying that will make people respond negatively to that. Some people, hey, we're not taking that on. That will make me sleep less well at night if we're taking that on. But the idea is superintendent doesn't mean you're responsible for doing everything, but you're responsible for checking and making sure everything that is done to protect payments that should be done is being done and that it's understood. And so there's different accountabilities, but there's responsibilities that need to be understood properly. If your job is steward and protecting the data, that doesn't mean you install patches to the firewall, but it does mean your organization or someone in your purview is checking, tracking, and making sure that is managed and managed well, and you understand what the gaps are, how they're being protected or covered up with layers of security.
Thanks for that explanation, Craig. I know that was a loaded question. Can you give some examples of loss of assets or liquidity that have been broadcasted or covered in national or international news, perhaps?
A couple in the book I mentioned. Some of these are a little bit older, but Parmalat and Satayam, these are examples of a loss of control for both accounting as well as bank account management and cash management, cash auditing, where there were significant losses in the tune of more than 4 billion euro and issues there. So that's worth reading in the book. Another more recent one was Wirecard. This is a significant fraud where there's this round tripping where payments were being sent through the banking system to third parties, and it allowed them to cover up activity until eventually the auditors were saying, we can't certify, this doesn't look right. And then everything unfolded. And we've done a short YouTube video on parts of that, and we've written some material and done some case studies there. But that's a significant issue. Is good bank account management means daily visibility. And what does visibility mean? It means that if you're trying to cover things up, now you've got to cover them up for more people because they can see I'm sending money over here, money's coming back. It looks like there's a lot of activity, but it's bearing what's going on. So daily visibility prohibits or restricts the ability to perform some of these internal fraud, but it also lets you detect external fraud more quickly. Another example is the Central Bank of Bangladesh, and that's a few years old now, but it was through compromise of internal systems and used the messaging system of SWIFT to send instructions. So once they had lost control or the criminals had really been given complete run of the system, and it's a really interesting case study. And I think in our show notes, we should list some of our other podcasts where we talk about that in more depth because it's an interesting discussion. I know we've done some webinars on that too, but $951 million of instructions were sent out because the criminals had gained control of systems. Now, $101 million went out from their bank accounts at the New York Fed. All the instructions went, but it tripped some AML or anti-money laundering alerts in the system, so it stopped the final 850 million of transfers from being enacted. The messages were delivered, but it raised a flag because this was substantial. And what happened was they lost a total of $81 million. They recovered $20 million because of a smart banker who, noticed interesting or very anomalous behavior, put a freeze on it. Because there was a freeze placed on it, they were able to get it back, but they never recovered the $81 million. It was moved around. It was prohibited from being seen or discovered quickly, and they were able to move that money out of the banking system through casinos. So very, very significant loss, for Bangladesh, and that was a triggering event for SWIFT to help make sure that the endpoints that they provided more requirements around all the endpoints of the SWIFT network, so that those who are on SWIFT, established and used commercially reasonable procedures for security, and so that was great for SWIFT to require people to be reasonable in their practices for protecting their surface areas of attack because they are connected to the SWIFT network and they can send messages. It made sense for them to increase the defensive posture of all of those on the network. Very, very good standard. It wasn't a SWIFT problem. It was a problem with not securing your own network. And that followed, years before the payment card industry set up PCI DSS data security standards. So this was, how do we protect the card network? And that created a whole standard of how we protect data security. And that included protecting the people front as well. I can give you dozens of examples of business email compromise or phone compromise or some of these other examples where someone spoofs AP, someone in treasury, someone in finance, someone in the executive row, convinces them that they need to pay more rapidly, convinces them to change payment instructions to a new location, whether it's leveraging people working from home during the pandemic or other activities. There's so many creative ways that criminals use to spoof people, and they may not compromise an email system or hack a system, though they do, but they find a way to fool people to make those changes, and then money is sent out, money leaves the building, and it might not be discovered for a long period of time, and you suffer a loss. And this is a significant issue and challenge.
Those are incredible examples. Would you say that fraud is still on the rise today more than ever?
Yeah, fraud has become far more automated and far more sophisticated. So as we look back on some of our survey data and the loss data that you can see through central police organizations like the FBI, we see that it's rising. The expectation is that the attack methods are more sophisticated, they're more prolific and sustained, largely because they're more automated, and this is resulting in higher payoffs, larger return for them, for the criminals. So it is, despite more being spent on defenses, there's significant weapons escalation with automated attacks, everything from ransomware to phishing attacks to methods of penetrating systems. It's huge. They're making large payoffs, and nation states are involved in it as well. Not just big crime rings, but there's nation state actors who devote dozens and sometimes hundreds of resources to do a cashectomy on an organization through this type of fraud.
Wow, that's just unbelievable. Any final thoughts or advice to treasurers?
Yeah, sure. I know I talked about systems and people and bank accounts. The other area about processes, I just wanted to talk about, maybe not processes as much as security principles. Two security principles are quite important among the 12 that we talk about. One is more well known as segregation of duties, where you have multiple people have to work in concert. This is excellent. As a treasurer, as anybody in treasury, anybody in accounts payable or finance, the idea of segregation of duties is quite well understood, right? If you have no segregation of duties, one person on their own can do it. If they're dishonest, they have the means or the motive. There's the likelihood that could occur. If they don't have the means, they're not going to do it. That's pretty well understood. The principle of least privilege is understood to some extent. It's far more immature. This idea of, do you have access in a process to do certain functions against certain entities for moving funds, for setting up payment information? Why is this important? Because the principle of least privileges, people shouldn't see more than they need to. They shouldn't be able to do more than they need to. This is a good control feature for several reasons. One, so that an individual can't do more than they should or cause more harm than should be the case if they were doing something criminal or lifting data or doing something negative towards the organization. But it also protects the organization so that if someone gains access to a credential or to a person's ID, they can't go and enact the theft of data, the theft of funds, the changing of instructions. This is really, really important. This is a really, really important principle that is not nearly as well managed. More people are aware of multi-factor authentication to make sure that a credential isn't compromised, but they're not as focused on restricting the surface areas that they can get to. And I think that's a key area. And I know this was the final thoughts, and I've already spent more time responding to that. But there's this other idea of I'm falsely confident. I'm sleeping well, but I shouldn't. You can be up at night or whatever you can be overly concerned. And then you can also be overly confident. Now, those issues can't happen to us. We looked at our stuff 4 years ago. I think the idea of, if you've looked at your processes, your people, the systems, the bank account structure, your overall framework of protection, and you're looking at that every year on a detailed basis, and then you're getting third parties to assist on that at least every 2 years, preferably every 18 months, to see what are the potential exposures. How do we close those gaps? How do we make sure we're using at least a standard of good corporate conduct, if not world-class practices? That's how to make sure you don't sleep when you should be up. I think those are overconfidence is as much of a problem as anything else that exists in this world. Because the attack methods have grown, we need to make sure we're regularly reviewing and stepping up our game.
Craig, that's excellent advice. Thank you for this interesting and very important discussion. I also want to take a moment to thank our listeners around the globe for tuning in. Have a great day.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.